Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thanks to the students for showing up and to all the colleagues of Bruce from near and far who've come for today's lecture. I've been wrestling with how to refer to this lecture, actually, over the last week or two. I don't want to really call it Bruce's terminal lecture or Bruce's sounds a bit morbid, doesn't it? Or Bruce's final lecture, because I know this will not be his final lecture. Bruce, like a force of nature, is somewhat unstoppable, and I've been given pause, actually, by these 3 bottles of water here. I don't know what we're in for this afternoon. But in any case, we're here to celebrate 39 years of teaching at Duke. This will be Bruce's, this is the last celebratory lecture for Bruce as a professor of a regular class at the university. That's all I can say about this event. In any case, we have a colleague who joined me at Duke the same year I came in 2001, who knows Bruce's CV and work inside out, a close friend of Bruce and an esteemed colleague, and my own friend, Ebrahim Musa, to do a more formal introduction. But anyway, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon. Friends and colleagues, thank you for joining the Department of Religion this afternoon, where we honor and celebrate the scholarly achievements, collegial bonds, and our ties of friendship with Bruce Bennett Lawrence. In Europe, when academics reach the level of a full professor, they mark it with an inaugural lecture. In America, it's different. The stakes are higher on entering the academy as a professor. Ask every or any assistant professor. The exit is associated with less fanfare. In joining Professor Bruce Lawrence in his last official class lecture today, the Department of Religion at Duke University is setting a precedent by starting a new tradition associated with fanfare. We are asking all retiring faculty in our department to deliver something akin to a valedictory lecture. Why today? Well, Bruce will be on leave for the next academic year and then officially retires at the end of the academic year 2011. So we need to catch him while we can. To many of us, Bruce is a colleague and a mentor. We know him as a spouse of Miriam. Some of us know him as a brother to his siblings, a father to Anna and Rachel, and a grandpa to delightful and energetic grandkids. But Bruce also radiates something more that makes us all of us feel part of his family. He has a capacious embrace for people across different cultures, societies, and spaces, and for people of different faiths, orientations, and walks of life. It is an embrace that discloses the depth of his humanity, the kindness of his soul, and a genuine sensitivity that lurks skin deep behind his trademark booming voice and joyful laughter. This built-in cosmopolitanism of the spirit goes back to his formation. In 1903, Joseph Stagg Schmalz left Budapest in Hungary and arrived in Buffalo at the age of 7 with his parents. Interrupting his studies at Princeton University, Joseph volunteered to serve in World War I and changed his last name from Schmalz to Lawrence in order to avoid discrimination against American soldiers of Germanic origin. Joseph Lawrence, from then on, acquired a PhD and became a scholar of economics and published several books, and then moved on to banking. Toward the end of the 1930s, Joseph Lawrence met Emma Frances Bennett, who was born in New York. She was a successful businesswoman in her own right. Joseph and Emma raised 4 sons in New Jersey, the eldest of whom was Bruce, who was born in Newton, New Jersey. His other siblings were Larry, Dean, and Guy. Bruce followed the path blazed by his father Joseph to Princeton University and went on to graduate magna cum laude, where he studied Arabic and history of the Middle East. After a stint of service in the Navy, he went to the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he attained a Master's in Divinity degree. In 1967, he went to Yale University, where he pursued the PhD in the history of religions, specializing in Islam and Hinduism, and worked with the legendary Franz Rosenthal. In 1971, Bruce began as an assistant professor in the Department of Religion at Duke University, and in 1 year after completing his dissertation, listen to this, he was tenured at Duke in 1973 after declining a tenure offer from Columbia University. It worked in Duke's favor that Bruce did not like big cities, but now you also know that he's very fast out of his starting blocks. Bruce has held many distinguished positions at Duke, and despite many attractive offers from elsewhere, Duke managed to retain him every time. Bruce's major interest in comparative religion naturally turned into an interest in comparative area studies, and he directed a program by that name for several years. He chaired the Department of Religion, became the inaugural Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Humanities Professor of Religion, directed the Center for South Asian Studies for some time, and he was the inaugural director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center. Most recently, he was named Carnegie Scholar. This prestigious grant was awarded to him to explore the fate of religious minorities as citizens in countries like Ethiopia, as well as in the Philippines and Indonesia. And I'm only highlighting some of his achievements in the interest of time. Bruce has an enviable scholarly record and an intimidating intellectual output. I'm not going to count his published essays, journal articles, and book chapters. On last count, he had published 7 single-authored books, and an 8th one that he co-authored with one of his closest colleagues at UNC, Carl Ernst, who's joining us here today. Together with Carl, they also edited a very successful and prestigious book series titled Islamic Civilization and Muslim Networks at the University of North Carolina Press. Bruce started his scholarly career by studying the way an 11th century Persian scholar by the name of Shahrastani viewed Indian religions. That interest led to more curiosity about India, most notably Indian mysticism, especially in the Muslim iteration of that tradition. Over an academic career spanning nearly 4 decades, Bruce really never left South Asia. But he always followed the multiple radii of the religions of India within and beyond the subcontinent. He continued to study Islamic mysticism and spirituality in different eras of Indian history. He followed the connection of spirituality not only to Persia, but also how religion through law, politics, as well as mysticism became visible on a global stage. These are the subjects that he treats in Shattering the Myth, Islam Beyond Violence, or in Sufi Martyrs of Love, the Chishti Brotherhood in South Asia and Beyond, a book that he co-authored with Carl Ernst. This was followed by his study of how Asian religions take shape and form in the New World, in new faiths, old fears, Muslims and other Asian immigrants in American religious life. Notable among Bruce's books is the prize-winning Defenders of God, in which he explored religious fundamentalism in 3 traditions. It is a book that expanded our understanding of religiously inspired violence by making innovative connections between political theory and the study of religion. Most recently, his other very successful book, The Quran, a biography, was translated into 16 languages, and was published under the logo 10 Books That Changed the World. An indicator of his success with this book is not the size of his advance, that too maybe, but that the book has gone into multiple editions, selling thousands of copies. Among Bruce's books that has contributed to the public understanding of Islam beyond the academy, if there is any book among Bruce's many books that contributed to the public understanding of Islam beyond the academy, then it is this one. Of course, Bruce's timing in publishing was also superb. He got his book out before the punishing recession and while people had money to buy books. Bruce has edited 6 important scholarly volumes. Of course, South Asia features prominently. One volume he edited with his North Carolina State colleague and friend, the historian David Gilmartin, called Beyond Turk and Hindu. He also translated the seminal work of a major Indian Sufi of the 14th century, Nizamuddin Awliya. Bruce also pioneered the idea of thinking about Muslim societies globally as network spaces over time. He explores this dimension in a range of studies that displace traditional area study models in order to make our understanding and explanation of human ecologies more dynamic, nimble, and precise. The outcome of this breakthrough research was a collaborative effort with his wife, Miriam Cook, professor of modern Arabic literature and culture at Duke. Their efforts culminated in a publication called Muslim Networks: From Hajj to Hip Hop. Bruce also edited a volume on the formative North African scholar Ibn Khaldun, and more recently he edited the speeches of Osama bin Laden, an assignment and topic that has kept Bruce very busy at conferences and in the media limelight for many, many hours. As a teacher and mentor, Bruce set a high standard in his dedication to his students. Not only does he treat every student, graduate and undergraduate, with utmost respect and attention, but he often goes the extra mile. He would take writing a student letter as seriously as he would in writing an article for a prestigious journal. Today, the graduate students that he had mentored, and some of them are here, have all graduated, and they've made important inroads in the study of religion, culture, and literature in the US and beyond, making the Duke brand proud with the BBL endorsement. Among his graduate students, there are several present today. I see and I acknowledge Randall Stiers, Lou Ruprecht, Kelly Jarrett, Umid Safi, and if I did not acknowledge a graduate student who already graduated, please make your presence felt by yelling. To most of us outside Bruce's family circle, who are connected to him through Duke and the broader academy, there are lasting bonds. Richard Martin, professor of Islam and religion at Emory University, is one such close colleague with whom Bruce has fostered a significant friendship over many decades. I only mention the guests from out of town. There is no shortage of such close connections with colleagues in the department, across the university, and beyond. Bruce is to many of us, and how do I describe it best? He is an intellectually vibrant, spiritually generous, viscerally close, and intensely loyal friend. Bruce embodies friendship in words crafted by the medieval Arabic poet Al-Mutanabbi in two simple lines. ما الخل إلا من أود بقلبه وأرى طرفا لا يرى بسوائه. A friend is one with whose heart I love. When I look, I see with the eyes of the friend. Bruce is a joyous fellow whose youth-like energy knows no bounds and whose friendship envelopes you in a relationship that might be difficult to name given its capaciousness. But there's one thing it will never be: it is never boring with Bruce. I'm sure many of you must have at least had an experience with Bruce where you had seen him get excited at least 3 times in one day. If that was your experience, then chalk that day up as one in which Bruce has had a bad day. For on most days, Bruce is high energy all the time. In preparation for his retirement, Bruce has recently upgraded his car to a later model. He plans to take several trips to the ocean, he told me. But most of us doubt if Bruce really had figured out what retirement means. Sure, he wanted to do more miles with his car, but I doubt it will be more motor vehicle miles. My prediction is that it will most likely be more frequent flyer miles to meetings and conferences, and at least a couple of books. So there you go. Go, Bruce, go. More personally, I do lack the words that can express my friendship and debt to Bruce. This is the tough part. I need to keep my eyes dry and my voice strong. Bruce and I met at the American Academy of Religion annual conference in New Orleans in 1996 on a morning jog. Several years later, he recruited me to Duke, and it has been an amazing run ever since. In a friendship of more than a decade, I'm still trying to catch up with him. Can he be a handful? Of course. But if in your friendship with Bruce you have not, if in your friendship with Bruce you have not calculated intensity in all his dimensions, you do not get to know the real and lovable Bruce. I try not to think what my life at Duke will be like when Bruce is no longer my colleague, whom I see on a daily basis. What is comforting, though, is that he is only a phone call away. The great poet Rainer Maria Rilke reminds us, we need in love to practice only this, letting each other go. For holding on comes easily, we do not need to learn it. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Humanities Professor of Religion, our colleague, our friend, and my bosom friend, Bruce Bennett Lawrence, and I invite him to address you. Please help me to give him a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Joe. That's good. That's good. That's good. You're the best. You're the best. Wow. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to make this short. I can't say very much that would justify all the words Ibrahim, except I did want to comment that when he was reading the biography of my father, and I heard him mention that his name changed from Joseph Schmalz to Joseph Lawrence. I was really grateful because had he kept his name and I was named Bruce, my initials might have fit some other description of my work. I'm sorry, only some of you are laughing. There are 4 parts to what I'm going to say today in what I've tapped to be my final, but I hope not my terminal lecture at Duke. And I'm kind of fond of alliteration, so I'm going to call it reading, recap, reflection, and return. So let me start with a reading. The reading comes from the Exeter Bulletin, spring of 2010. For those of you who didn't know it, I went to that school up in New Hampshire and was class of 58, and I'm actually now the president of that class. And so I wrote a note back in November 2009 thinking about this, my last year at Duke, and this is what I said. I'm enjoying my final year of teaching at Duke University. In 1971, I came to North Carolina for a year or 2 at most. I now find myself looking back at almost 40 years of continuous service and residence here. High points are many, low points are few. The lowest certainly was 9/11/2001. I was entertaining a Muslim visitor speaking about the beauty of Islamic art when we got the news. One of the Twin Towers has been hit. We went on with the seminar. 20 minutes later came the follow-up. The second tower has been hit. It looks like a tag team of suicide bombers. And I think Rob Sikorsky's in the audience, and Rob is the one that came in the room and said, I think it's happened. My Muslim visitor, an Ismaili scholar from London, Azim Nanji, never got out of Durham on that day. He was a reluctant long-term visitor, and I have been a reluctant long-term commentator on the saga that followed and still lingers for much of America. My book, Messages to the World, The Statements of Osama bin Laden, was one small effort to burrow into the brain of the al-Qaeda mastermind of that tragedy. And 2 others, an anthology on violence and also the biography of the Quran that Ibrahim mentioned. These have become framed narratives that exceeded the moment of 9/11, as also the person of bin Laden, while trying to gain insight into the persistent complexity of both. If I had to provide one high moment to this gloomy period, it would be a talk I gave to PSYOPS. PSYOPS is the nickname for the 4th Psychological Operations Group Airborne at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It is the only active Army psychological operations unit in the country, and they brought together 120 officers worldwide back in summer of 2007, trying to make sense of what the U.S. military had done and has yet to do in waging asymmetric war against a non-state enemy. I was the keynote speaker. I was bombarded with questions, but the final quote belonged to the commanding officer. Citing Sun Tzu, the Chinese general who lived at a time when China was divided, he noted that we still have to follow Sun Tzu's motto, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And bin Laden made this challenge as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. And so I retire from active duty in the academy with a sense that Afghanistan remains the biggest test of American foreign policy. We have still not gotten close enough to that enemy to understand, much less to defeat him. So that's the first part. And now about my life, personal and professional, over several decades, also marked with those external events that define our world, beginning with World War II. If I had to put one word next to my life, I would say that it has been marked, above all, by privilege. I was privileged to be born into a tight-knit family 4 months before Pearl Harbor, In the 1940s, my father and mother raised 4 sons in rural New Jersey, as Ibrahim mentioned, teaching us all that we had to work hard and be fair, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the stakes. My father died when I was age 9, but my mother continued his legacy, moving us to suburban Connecticut in the early 50s, going back to work herself, remarrying, and making life seem normal for all her sons, of whom I was the eldest. I was also the most difficult. If my younger brothers were here, they would agree. I chafed in public school, and so was rewarded by being sent off to boarding school at age 11. I went from Fay to Exeter to Princeton, and then into the U.S. Navy, where my real education began. I had toyed with languages, learning Latin, French, German before college, then Arabic and Turkish at Princeton, but my deepest passion was history mingled with philosophy. I had thought of careers in the Foreign Service, perhaps law, certainly not business, and never, never the church or the academy. As a result of 2 years in the Navy, I became an ordained Episcopal minister, and now a soon-to-be retired professor of religion from Duke University. So much for plans. The crucial defining years of my life were 1962 to 1964. I was almost part of the U.S. invasion of Cuba in October '62. It never happened, yet it seemed perilously close when in the summer of '62 I was stationed on board the USS Sandoval, an APA amphibious platoon attack ship homeported in Norfolk, Virginia. That fall, after the crisis subsided, I was sent from Norfolk to DC, where I spent nearly 2 years in the Office of Naval Intelligence, which I often say to people ask me what it is. I say it's intelligence for those who don't have it but have to use it. It was an ordinary day in November 1963 when, coming back to my office after a lunchtime game of squash in the 8th corridor of the Pentagon, my staff sergeant told me, "Lieutenant Lawrence, the president's been shot." I scolded him. That's treasonous talk. Then went upstairs to my office, where I found all my co-workers gathered around the TV watching events unfold in Dallas. Not only was President Kennedy dead, but all the certainties of my life suddenly seemed less certain, the careers I had once considered now infinitely less desirable. I began to read a lot after hours, and also to audit classes in the evening at National Cathedral. I was drawn to explore religion, not just as a topic, but perhaps as a vocation. And when I went back to school in fall 1964, I did not go to study law or politics or history, but religion. At ETS, that's Episcopal Theological School, which later became Episcopal Divinity School, I learned Hebrew and Greek. I also audited classes on Islamic thought at Harvard, taught by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, from whom I learned how to do footnotes and how not to do them. Do them, but try and keep them not quite as long as Wilfred, that is less than a page. I went to Cairo in summer 1966, and there discovered the joys and challenges of Egyptian Arabic. I graduated from seminary just as the Six-Day War was unfolding between Israel and its Arab neighbors in June 1967. I was privileged yet again, not by family or by friends, but by a teacher. Carl Edwards, a Duke graduate, had encouraged me to apply for a scholarship. Why did I need a scholarship? Well, argued Carl, you might find yourself less suited to the parish than to the classroom, less to the pulpit and more to the lectern, and look where I am today. I applied and received a Danforth scholarship. It paid for a full 4 years of doctoral work anywhere in the USA. And frankly, I was torn between Harvard, where I'd come to know and appreciate many faculty, and Yale, which had the advantage of being in my home state, Connecticut, and the disadvantage of being in New Haven. Well, there are few people who've been in New Haven and know what I'm talking about. I forgot about urban blight as soon as I met Franz Rosenthal, or Mr. Rosenthal, as he preferred to be called. Mr. Rosenthal convinced me that I could find a way into academic life under his tutelage. I accepted the invitation and added Norman Hine, or Mr. Hine, to my roster of great teachers, as also, I should say, Mr. Weinstein, Stanley Weinstein, who taught him, was a major mentor for my colleague and good friend, Richard Jaffe. And so I ventured from Islam into the Indic or Hindu world, studying Sanskrit along with classical Arabic. By 1970, I was ready to give my first professional paper. The setting was the University of California at Santa Cruz, famous or infamous to scholars of religion because of Norman O. Brown, or Nobby Brown, the brilliant, playful philosopher, tutor to Isaiah Berlin, author of Love's Body, The Clarion Cry for Embodied Religion, and late in life a devotee of Marshall Hodgson, the foremost Islamicist of 20th century America. I'm getting ahead of my own life story. The group to which I belonged in 1970 as a Danforth Scholar was the Society for Religion in Higher Education, later the Society for Values in Higher Education, which my former student Lou Reprecht has written more articles than many people have written essays. They had elected, the society had elected to hold their annual summer meeting at Santa Cruz in August 1970. I gave a paper, luckily for all of you, never published, by a Roman Catholic scholar on the unknown Christ of Hinduism. It had received an A at Yale, but in my view, was unexceptional. Still, I thought it would do out in California. After my presentation, a senior member of the society asked me to lunch. He liked the paper. He also liked my engagement with Islam, in addition to Catholicism and Hinduism. Would you consider teaching at Duke? Where is that? In North Carolina. Too far from New England, I thought to myself. Why would I go there? Forgetting that my favorite seminary professor had also been from North Carolina and was in fact a graduate of Duke. My lunchtime interlocutor forgave my ignorance and took no note of my insolence. I was invited to Duke. It was love at first sight. I found not just an academic post, but a community. And 40 years later, I remain indebted to Tom Langford. Tom was then chair of the Department of Religion, later Dean of Divinity, eventually provost at Duke. Tom, or Tommy as he was known to many, remained a lifelong friend, mentor, confidant, wise, and winsome in equal measure. Soon after arriving at Duke, I was also privileged to have the chance to travel. I got a summer grant to go to India in '73 after having been on a trip to Pakistan and Turkey the preceding year. In India, I went to Aligarh and met there the second most influential academic mentor of my still unformed professional life, and that was K.A. Nizami. I had been committed to exploring multiple religions, principally Islam and Hinduism. I knew, or at least could navigate texts in Arabic and Sanskrit, but I did not know more than basic Persian, and I had never thought of studying Urdu. But Professor Khalik Ahmed Nizami of the History Department at Aligarh Muslim University convinced me that my PhD was a credential, but not a roadmap. He told me that India, not Egypt or the Middle East, was the place where I should devote my energies and re-hone my skills. But how? Well, I found yet another scholarship. It was awarded for 1 year, but I stretched it to 2. I spent 1974 to 76 on leave from Duke. I lived in Aligarh. As it turned out, I lived in the Nizami Villa, because between the time I first talked to Professor Nizami and the time I arrived in Aligarh, he had been appointed Indian ambassador to Syria, conveniently vacating his new home in Dodhpur, where I lived with my family for 2 years. And there I studied Persian. I learned passable Urdu. I began the study of a new field, Sufism, Indo-Persian Sufism. It became the window into my future as a scholar of religion and history. I was privileged yet again when I returned to Duke. My marriage had faltered. I was separated, then divorced, but I discovered a new colleague who was not only my intellectual match, but my soulmate. Miriam and I met, courted, and married in 1983, changing my life even more dramatically than I could ever have imagined. Miriam also arranged for Mr. Rosenthal to come to Duke. We organized a symposium for him on Ibn Khaldun, whom Ibrahim mentioned, and we later were able to have a book pulled together from the talks that were given at that symposium, a book dedicated to the foremost pre-modern Muslim historian, Ibn Khaldun. We also, Miriam and I later were able to visit Mr. Rosenthal in New Haven, when in 1984 it seemed possible that I might be offered a post at my old alma mater. But again, it was Tom Langford who counseled me about the dangers of going back and also the prospects of going forward. Miriam and I stayed at Duke then, and again in 1987 when it seemed we might relocate, not to Connecticut, but to California. Other temptations have appeared, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to teach at Oxford and Chicago for brief periods, but I've always returned to Durham and to Duke, where I share this space, these colleagues, and this forum with Miriam. It would not be possible to conclude even a brief overview of my life without mentioning briefly books. Not all the merit, don't worry, not all the merit sustained attention, but I'll just mention 4. The first book that drew me away from the pre-modern textual world of Shahrastani and Islamic intellectual history was Defenders of God. After the Iranian Revolution, I was challenged to make sense of what was and often still is called Islamic fundamentalism. Islamic fundamentalism? What about Christian fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism, Sikh, Hindu, or Buddhist fundamentalism? I tried to make sense of the multiple faces of religious ideology labeled fundamentalism, and the result was Defenders of God. Dog, as it is affectionately known, it does parse as dog. Dog would have remained just another clunky academic monograph except for my mother-in-law. Edith Cook was an extraordinary human being and about the most intelligent and certainly the most ruthless reader I've ever known. She devoured Dog and pronounced it a bestseller with one qualification. It needed an introduction that simply, directly, persuasively told the reader the gist of my argument. Nobody ever told me that before. I had spent 3 years writing the book. It took another 3 weeks to satisfy my mother-in-law. The result was not quite a bestseller, but it was an award-winning monograph in no small part due to Edith's expertise and zeal. 3 other books also loom large in defining who I am and what I have tried to do as an engaged scholar. I've been privileged to know some colleagues with unstinting generosity. And just so I don't embarrass anybody here, I'll name somebody from abroad. Christopher Shackle of SOAS. Christopher is a true multilinguistic enthusiast of South Asian Sufism, like my good friend Carl Ernst. Chris had read a couple of my books and several of my articles on the Chishtiya, a major Sufi order of India. What about that translation of Fuad al-Fuad, he asked me at a conference we were both attending in Heidelberg in the summer of 1989. Well, I can't get the poetry right, I sheepishly replied. There are about 42 couplets or quatrains that accent this remarkable prose document from the leading figure of North Indian Chishti devotion, and to put them into ordinary prose or bad poetry would defeat the purpose and empty the elegance of the Persian original. Send them to me, he replied. I did, and 3 months later they were back to me in hand-scribbled notes that offered rhymes in English to match, if not always to equal, their Persian counterparts. Morals for the Heart has been my happiest book, and Professor Nizami came to Duke in the early 90s soon after its publication. He pronounced his own happiness with the book, and he stayed with us in the new home which Miriam and I had built in Hillsborough, and he pronounced that it was a suitable North Carolina Sufi Khanqa. Only a few people can laugh at that. It means it's kind of like a place where you can hang out and pray and have a good time, which it still is. Miriam and I have not only been married for over 25 years, but our marriage has survived, barely, co-editing a book together and co-writing the introduction. That is, of course, Muslim Networks, from Hajj to Hip Hop. We had a conference at Duke on Muslim Networks soon after 9/11 in which Richard Martin was a major figure and helpful putting together and being there and making sure that people kept to the time and to the topic. We received some spectacular papers from participants, and one later from a new, alas now relocated colleague, Sami Alim, who provided the hip hop in the subtitle, Muslim Networks from Hajj to Hip Hop. Miriam and I have taught the book together, most recently in a class, a capstone with ISC majors, some of whom are here today, and also Mashal Saif, who's helped us very much in guiding students and sometimes the professors through that class. My final book to note is the one Ibrahim earlier mentioned, the Quran, a biography. Now, some of you know me pretty well, and all of you, whether you know me well or not very well, I should know that I am not an expert on the Quran. I'd never intended to write a book on the Noble Book, as I call it. But an invitation came out of the blue, literally an email request. Instead of erasing it, I shared it with Miriam, and her response was immediate and emphatic. You have to do it. Why? Because it's part of you. You always travel with the Quran, you refer to it, you engage it, and now you can write about it. And as Ibrahim noted, even get paid for writing about it. Miriam was, of course, right. And 3 years later, that monograph did appear. My mother-in-law would have been proud. Written in clear English, or at least as clear as I can produce without footnotes, with no cluttering of foreign terms or excessive qualifications about competing arguments or contrary evidence, just a book on the Noble Book. And parenthetically, I must say, and some of you who are scholars and colleagues of mine know that you never know what others will make of what you write. This past weekend at a conference, one participant crept up behind me and announced, "Dr. Bruce, will you autograph this book for me?" And I turned around and saw him handing to me the Quran, a biography. "Wait, how did you know I was Dr. Bruce?" "The Imam told me so." The Imam W.D. Muhammad, a friend and also the subject of chapter 13 in my book on the Noble Book. Enough about my writings. Let me now share with you, and this is part 3. You've only got, I'm over halfway through, don't worry. Let me now share with you something which I would call a set of reflections about embodied religion, echoing Nobby Brown. Embodied religion, of course, is dear to the labor and legacy of many of my colleagues, including Leela Prasad and David Morgan, who are here today. But I have to say it also enthralls me. Call what follows my intellectual creed. It mingles poetry with prose. It addresses the senses. It tries to bring them together, but also evokes secular as well as religious sources to make the larger point about our common humanity. You don't need to turn off your cell phone, just answer it. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to read poetry with a cell phone going on. Thank you. So, the quotations. The first is on touch, and it comes from John Donne. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. That I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend, your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. Elsewhere, I've compared this tactile, even brutal sonnet with Indo-Persian and Urdu poems known as ghazals. Knock, break, blow, burn, capture, ravish, all have their lexical equivalents in Persian, then Indo-Persian, and also Urdu verse. Sight is not absent. It's often combined with other senses, as from the poet Saadi. Come, out of the pain of love for you, I am bewildered without you. Come, see in this pain how unhappy I am without you. O beloved, not for one moment have you given me the drink of your union. It is the bitter poison of separation that I taste forever. I have given the message and I have said, come, make me happy. You have answered and said, I am happy without you. The physicality of this poem is less forceful than Donne's, yet we have again sight, privileged, followed by pain, reflecting touch, and then the bitter taste or poison of separation. Occasionally, smell is evoked as an echo of separation, again from Saadi. I long for your aroma, wherever you are. I long for the sight of you, where are you? But it is fire that recurs, as in the Indo-Persian poet Iraqi when he laments, though my soul expires due to pain, the pain of your love is better than my soul. In my soul, the burning of your torment is far better than the water of paradise. Touch, fire, taste, water appear as the central senses of religious experience also for the most renowned of all Persian mystic poets. While Rumi uses the raw physicality of wine and blood in his verse, he weaves a story that brings heaven to earth rather than raising the dreamer into a theophanic embrace. Other poetic traditions include the one, which I believe is behind me, of a Christian monk who focused on wine, talk about wine, but central to the lyrical imagination of Rumi is the tavern where drinkers become drunkards, consuming wine, the forbidden substance that for them becomes the key to love, as in this verse. Who has ever seen such a mess? The tavern of love filled with drunkards. Who has ever seen so many barrels shattered on the ground? The floor and the ceiling of heaven are all splattered with wine. But who has ever seen a cup of wine in anyone's hand? We drink the wine of our own blood, aged in the barrels of our own souls. We would give our lives for a sip of that nectar, our heads in exchange for one drop. Another morning, pour the wine. A life without his love is nothing but slow death. It's up to you, accept the cry of the silent rhubarb, or endure this burning heart filled with grief. O eyes, look only in his direction. O soul, hang your clothes on the wheel of life and death. O tongue, let the lover sing. O ears, become drunk with his song. I'm in love. All your advice, what's the use? I've drunk poison, all your sugar, what's the use? They say, hurry, tie his feet. But it's my heart that's gone crazy. All this rope around my feet, what's the use? They say paradise will be sublime with jugs of precious wine and plenty of damsels to fill our cups. Why not drink that wine now? Why not join the dance now? For that's how it's going to be anyway. Hearing, drinking, dance, play, they are a Muslim reflex, but they're also shared with other traditions. Consider the conclusion of Mano Suri's stunning novel, The Death of Vishnu. This is not the god, the Hindu god Vishnu. It's actually an odd job vagrant in a Bombay apartment house. But at the end of this novel, he too has an epiphany where the sense of sound and touch are as keen and as central as the expected sense of sight. A brief passage from The Death of Vishnu by Mano Suri. After the light comes darkness. Someone is playing a flute. It is so sweet, it makes Vishnu want to cry. He follows the strands of sound. They guide him like a rope through the darkness. He feels the trees before he sees them. Twigs brush against his face. Fallen leaves rustle under his feet. The branches above sweep over his head as he walks past like giant hands reaching down unseen to bless him. The darkness fades. He sees the mist of a forest. Gradually that clears as well, and the trees, green and stately, come into focus. Through the trees he sees the boy. Beyond the meadow, a hut in the foreground, cows grazing on the grass behind. The boy is hiding behind a tree, watching a woman churn milk. As Vishnu comes up behind him, the boy turns. Shh, he whispers, a finger to his lips. And Vishnu sees that the color of his skin is tinged blue. Vishnu creeps up beside him. They watch the woman together. She is singing a song as she pulls the rope attached to the churn, first to the left hand, then with the right, in a rhythm that matches the tune. The boy looks at Vishnu. Are you ready? He asks. Before Vishnu can answer, the boy is off, running towards the woman. In one speedy bound, he reaches her, knocks over the churn. Milk splashes on the grass, a white sheet that spreads over the green. The woman screams as the milk cascades over her feet. The boy dips his hand into the churn and runs back to the trees as fast as he went. Wait till I tell Yashoda, the woman calls after him. Vishnu sees something white and creamy in the boy's palm. The boy holds it out to him. Vishnu looks at it but doesn't move. Don't you want any? Asks the boy, plunging a finger across his palm and licking it clean. Vishnu does the same. It is butter, but butter so smooth and rich, such as he has never tasted before. They eat the butter, fingerful by fingerful, and then the boy licks his palm clean. Would you like to play with me in the forest? The boy asks. Then he frolics into the trees. Vishnu looks after him for an instant and then runs in behind. Whatever comes after poetry and prose of this quality will be and should be regarded as pedestrian. But let me try and walk. First, consider Aristotle in making reflections on what the senses might mean. Aristotle posited the sensorium, or the sense of all the five senses, as both a taxonomy of traits and also a hierarchy, with sight and hearing on top, and then a long fall to smell, taste, and touch. Or consider what Philo, following Aristotle, said of the same sensorium. Of the five senses, taste, smell, and touch are animal and servile, while hearing and sight are higher. Why? Because they relate to philosophy. Yet ears are more sluggish and womanish than the eyes. Hence, special precedence must be given to sight, the queen of the senses, the closest to the soul. Or consider Enlightenment philosophers. Occupied with all the senses, they still differed enormously on which to place first. Emanuel Swedenborg has an elaborate hierarchy with sight on top and taste on the bottom. While the American philosopher William James was more pragmatic and less programmatic, he did famously prioritize sight, both the seen and the unseen. Faith for James, in a notable quote from one of his essays, Is Life Worth Living? Faith, notes James, is faith in the existence of an unseen order. But as a radical empiricist, he was committed to a pluralistic view of things. He marked true religion not as outward observance, but rather in almost Quakerish fashion as inner feeling illuminated by an inner light. And then there's Marx. Consider Marx. Though tagged as a materialist, he did speak of the sensorium, but favored not so much outward observance as variant and doggedly inclusive valuations of the full sensorium. Freud, for his part, acknowledged all the senses, but put the priority and the centrality on touch. Not only did touch signal the person's true being for Freud, but in the contest between ego and superego, Freud, the clinician, observed how time and again, quote, his patients sublimated or repressed touch in the interests of civilization, unquote. And finally, there has emerged an anthropology of the senses. Its purpose is to look at the role of senses and sensory judgments in multiple cultures. Hence, Wolof culture in Africa privileges touch over speech, taste, sight. The Wolof individuals often pair senses, linking touch to sound, as in the slide, which I hope is behind me, of a Wolof musician. And so finally, how can we detect our own sensory predispositions or biases? William James, in another one of his essays, Principles of Psychology, described a breakfast exercise. And let me repeat it for you. Recall what you ate at breakfast. Well, don't do it out loud, but just think of what you ate at breakfast. Describe to yourself your full menu. Then analyze the extent to which you depend on each of your senses in what you recall. Do you remember how you speak about, or do you remember the visual images of breakfast, or the bodily motions in eating, or the actual taste, or perhaps the smell that dominates? Which is it that lingers and provides the strongest memory for your breakfast that you've just had? If you can do that exercise, then perhaps you can do the following exercise, which I think helps you be honest about where you see yourself in senses. I call this the test that requires honesty but seldom gets it. There are 3 words which relate to sense in English: sensitive, sensible, and sensual. So my test is simple, and please don't try it out loud, but do try it sometime. Which of these do you invoke most often? Let me be honest and say that sensual ranks ahead of sensitive or sensible on my daily mind map. And when I think of sensual, or you think of it, whether it's often or only occasionally, is it not taste or touch that comes to mind when you evoke what is sensual? Sensitive, after all, means responsive, so it's an emotive reflex to sense stimuli. Sensible means prudent and is a mental mapping of sense-derived dangers. So only sensual appeals directly to the actual 5 senses. And to the extent that we engage our own imaginations in thinking about the spiritual as sensual, or the sensual as spiritual, I suggest we are more like the Wolof than we are like William James. So map your own futures, and may they be full of sensual, spiritual surprises. And just briefly to return to Nabi Brown, who after all got me started on thinking about embodied religion, I would like to say that my creed is half his, but only half. For those of you who know Nabi Brown, he finally said when he was 89 years old that all of his life could be summarized as polymorphous perversion. I'll take the polymorphous part, leave the perversion. For me, it is persistent polymorphism, the constant search for new terms that match our body with our soul, the senses, the spirit, within and beyond, often in language that for me is Muslim, whether Quranic or poetic or both. And so I challenge all of you to make this your quest. And in the meantime, let me just say that I would not have gotten to where I am in my quest had it not been for certain individuals who really have helped me in my journey. I started out by saying I've been privileged, and some would let me end by acknowledging that I've been privileged in more ways than I can find time or words to express here today. There are too many people who've assisted and enriched me for me to mention all the names, but let me just give a few quick notes that reflect a much larger list of individuals. And let me say, before I mention that among students, I wasn't going to do this, but I might as well. My first student is also the person whom I first saw when I came to campus today. I have to be honest, this is a tough day for me. You probably can't tell. I got up and I went for swam 20 laps and didn't feel wet, but otherwise fine. So it's been that kind of a day. Otherwise normal, but not at all. So when I came to campus, the very first person I saw was Michael Browder. And I said, Michael, this is really strange seeing you because when I first came to Duke, you were the first person I saw. When I walked into a classroom, you were the first person there. And then I went upstairs and got my class book going back to summer 1991. And the very first person in the first course that I ever taught at Duke was Michael H. Browder, who, by the way, got a B. So it just shows that grades aren't always the mark of lasting friendship. So Michael, thank you for persisting. By the way, he also came back and got a PhD with me on Manichaeism, which he might say is my true religion, and he's back here today. So thank you, Michael. I've been privileged also in the field of Islamic studies by several people. I want to mention Daryl McLean, whom some of you know, many of you don't. I actually first met Daryl in Aligarh, and when I had one of my first administrative posts at Duke, Daryl came back and was a part-time teacher in Islamic studies in our department, and later Vincent Cornell filled that temporary slot when it became permanent, and Vincent, of course, has now gone off and is a colleague of Rich Martin's at Emory. And Vince's big shoes, Vince is a big man, but he also has big shoes in every respect, were filled by my current colleague, collaborator, and friend, Ibrahim Musa. And in case he thought he'd get away without my saying something about him, you want to leave now? Like Daryl and Vince, Ibrahim has been the best of colleagues, not because he is like me, but because he is so much unlike me, having his own agenda and his own rigorous, if playful, way of pursuing it. It is in the rough and tumble of our collective engagement with Islam and Islamic studies that we have thrived and enjoyed our time here at Duke. And I also welcome in the audience today our newest colleague, Mona Hassan. I welcome her not only here, but to this fray, if I can call it that, knowing that she too will leave her mark on those privileged to know her and be part of her intellectual jihad, a ceaseless struggle to be the best for others and for humankind. Thank you all. Thank you very much.